Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and take a close look at what is arguably the most baffling unsolved disappearance in U.S. naval history. Look, we all know the Bermuda Triangle has claimed its fair share of vessels over the years, right? But absolutely none of them are as perplexing as the vanishing of the massive USS Cyclops back in 1918. So, we're going to examine the facts, the warning signs, and the most compelling theories to try and piece together exactly what happened.
Weather fair, all well. Just after clearing the port of Barbados on March 4, 1918, the crew sent this incredibly mundane, completely routine message. But here's the thing. Shortly after sending those reassuring words, a horrific tragedy unfolded, and the ship was literally never heard from again.
The really crucial point we have to wrap our heads around is how a massive, steel-hulled object and hundreds of people can just vanish into thin air. I mean, we aren't talking about a tiny fishing boat here. The Cyclops was the size of 1.5 football fields, and to this day, not a single piece of debris has ever been found. It's like the ultimate maritime locked room mystery.
Part 1. The Ship That Vanished.
Now, before we get too lost in the mechanics and the oceanography of it all, we really must remember the human cost here. When the Cyclops vanished, it took 309 souls with it: officers, crewmen, passengers. And honestly, it's sobering to realize that according to the U.S. Naval Institute, this remains the United States Navy's absolute largest loss of life in peacetime.
Built in 1910, the Cyclops was the largest collier, which is basically a coal-carrying ship in the Navy. But on this specific trip, it wasn't carrying coal. Instead, it was loaded up with up to 11,000 tons of manganese ore. This was a much heavier, far denser cargo than the ship usually carried, and to make matters worse, the crew had absolutely zero familiarity with it.
So, let's track the timeline of this final voyage. The ship departed Rio de Janeiro in mid-February, heading straight for Baltimore. But strangely enough, it made an unscheduled stop in Barbados on March 3rd to resupply. That's weird, because it should have had plenty of supplies for the trip. It departed the very next day, but, as we know, it never made its expected March 13th arrival.
Part 2. Warning signs and red flags.
It's actually startling to look back and see these compounded mechanical and cargo stowage issues. The ship had a cracked cylinder on its starboard engine, dropping its maximum speed from 15 knots down to just 10. A survey board actually recommended it head straight back to the U.S. for repairs. On top of that, inspectors noted the unfamiliar, dense cargo wasn't even spread evenly. It was piled dangerously high right in the middle of the ship.
And here is a truly terrifying detail. Inspectors in Barbados noted that the water was actually over the Cyclops' Plimsoll mark. Now, if you're not familiar, that's the legal limit a ship can be submerged in the water. So that means, plain and simple, this massive, ailing vessel was completely overloaded right before heading out into the open ocean.
Part 3. Investigating the theories.
Right off the bat, we can quickly dismiss the more fantastical ideas. Back in 1918, publications like the Literary Digest were actually suggesting a giant octopus dragged the ship down. And more recently, you've had guys like treasure hunter Daryl Miklos and astronaut Gordon Cooper hypothesizing about alien abductions in the Bermuda Triangle. But we're going to push past the sci-fi stuff and just focus on the cold, hard facts.
We definitely have to question if enemy forces were responsible. Remember, it was 1918, the absolute height of World War I, and the Cyclops was a prime asset for the U.S. Navy. An enormous coal and resource transport ship would have made an incredibly juicy target for any German U-boat lurking out in the Atlantic.
Because the captain, George W. Worley, was born in Germany, paranoid rumors started swirling that he was a double agent who simply surrendered the ship. But after the war, U.S. military intelligence painstakingly combed through German records. And guess what? They found zero evidence of submarines in the area, zero evidence of the Cyclops being captured, and absolutely zero proof that Worley was a spy.
So, if it wasn't the Germans, it leads us to ask, did the crew mutiny? Captain Worley was, by all accounts, a highly eccentric and really harsh punisher. He allegedly had this bizarre habit of pacing the quarterdeck wearing nothing but a hat, a cane, and his underwear. There were even some unconfirmed reports of a mutiny prior to the disappearance, where Worley supposedly heavily punished or even executed a dissenter. There's this chilling quote from U.S. Consul Alfred Gottschalk, who was actually a passenger on that final voyage, and it really highlights the deep, instinctive dislike the crew had for the captain. But logically, a mutiny still has one massive flaw. Think about it. If the crew took over, they still would have had to dock this gigantic ship somewhere. A stolen, massive U.S. naval vessel simply couldn't hide forever. This naturally leads us to look at natural phenomena. Meteorologist Dr. Joanne Simpson points to mesometeorological storms. These storms form violently and rapidly over the Gulf Stream, which was right in the Cyclops' path, and they vanish just as fast. Crucially, they cause immense electrical disturbances. This would perfectly explain why a ship being torn apart by chaotic waves wouldn't be able to get even a single radio distress call-out.
Part 4. A fatal design flaw. Now, what many consider to be the actual smoking gun lies with the Cyclops' 3 identical sister ships. Okay, so the Jupiter was sunk in combat, right? But look at the Nereus and the Proteus. Decades later, in 1941, both of them mysteriously vanished in the exact same Bermuda Triangle area. And what were they doing? They were both carrying heavy, incredibly dense ore, just like the Cyclops. This tragic history forms the basis of the structural flaw theory, which was presented by Navy Admiral George Van Doors. Over the years, carrying all that acidic coal likely eroded the ship's internal support beams. When you take that weakened structure and suddenly load it with incompatible, immensely heavy ore piled right up in the middle, the ship's spine simply gives out. The vessel likely broke completely in half and sank in minutes.
Part 5. An enduring maritime mystery.
So why haven't we found it yet? Well, one major obstacle is the nearby Puerto Rico Trench, located right at the southern tip of the Bermuda Triangle. This dark abyss drops a staggering 27,500 feet below sea level. To put that into perspective for you, that is just a few hundred feet shy of the height of Mount Everest. If the Cyclops broke in half and sank here, it was swallowed up in unreachable darkness.
There was a tiny glimmer of hope back in the 1960s, though. A seasoned Navy diver named Dean Hawes was diving off the coast of Virginia and actually thought he found the Cyclops' unique stilted bridge protruding from the ocean floor. Years later, he managed to convince the Navy to mount a search, only to discover it was a total false alarm. It was a completely different shipwreck altogether.
Ultimately, this tragedy was most likely a fatal combination of factors. You have an overloaded, crippled ship that's carrying improperly stowed, incredibly dense cargo. Add in those structurally weakened support beams, and top the whole thing off with an unpredictable, violently chaotic storm over the Gulf Stream. It was essentially the perfect, deadly storm of human error and natural fury.
And that brings us to the end of our explainer. I'll leave you to consider this question. Which of these compounding errors do you think was the final straw for the USS Cyclops? Was it a freak wave? Or did that massive steel hull simply snap under the overwhelming weight of its own cargo? Until the ocean gives up her secrets, the fate of those 309 souls is going to remain one of history's most fascinating mysteries.